So one of the sort of fascinating aspects of the story is the fact that Red enters prison when he's only 20 years old, and he ends up spending 38 years behind bars at Shawshank prison. So we can sort of think about this life behind bars that the prisoners experience and try to understand what it would be like, the most difficult parts of enduring this incarceration. For Andy especially, you can sort of think about what it would be like to be an innocent man being sentenced to life in prison, and consider, what kind of qualities it would take for that individual to endure that type of hardship or adversity in their lifetime. So if we were in class, I would ask you these questions, but you can enter or discuss these issues in the discussion forums. But I want you to sort of think about not just the physical aspects of survival that are might be encountered in prisons, such as the sort of threats of violence. Andy will face sexual violence, as well as sort of the brutality of guards and other prisoners, as well as the sort of psychological hardships of being a prisoner. And one of the things that we'll talk about is the way that the prison system sort of tries to break down the self-worth of its prisoners and teach them that they are sort of worthless, and are without value or any sort of sense of human integrity. So this is part of the psychological process that we'll talk about over and over again, and we can refer to it as institutionalization or becoming institutionalized. And Red will talk about this in relationship to prisoners like Brooks Hatlin. He'll also identify himself as a man who is institutionalized, and even Andy, to some degree, is sort of broken down and becomes sort of or internalizes the sort of prison system, and they each sort of struggle to maintain their sense of self and respect for their sort of inner spirit or inner strength when the prison itself seems to attempt to take this away from them. So definitely the quality that you need to survive will be to have a sort of enduring sense of self. And this is where Andy's character really is important and even symbolic in the narrative, as he is able to sort of maintain a hold of his personal integrity, his autonomy, and his individuality. So the prison, the warden, the guards, the violence within the system, all of this is not enough to break down Andy's spirit, right? He has the strength of his inner character to help him endure. So while you're reading, you can sort of pay attention to some of the motifs and symbols in the book. There's actually a lot of foreshadowing, and I'll get us to sort of think about this after we've read the complete narrative. But there's a lot of sort of motifs or symbols that are present and are sort of picked up throughout the narrative. The Rita Hayworth poster is one of the central symbols in the book. So I'm asking the question, besides the obvious. I mean, obviously these men who are prisoners who like to have beautiful women up in their cells for obvious reasons. But there's also sort of symbolic reasons associated with the posters. And one of these sort of symbolic elements is the fact that these women are sort of reminding the men of the outside world, of their freedom, and of the men they used to be before they were incarcerated and then broken down. So it is a reminder of the outside world and of freedom, and it gives them a sense of a little sort of glimmer of the life they used to have outside. So their freedom is sort of part of this motif. Another important symbol in the text is rocks and geology. And I want you to sort of note every time you read a passage that makes mention of rocks or geology, you should underline that and add it to your wiki pages, because these moments are sort of very important in reflecting Andy's character. He is a self-claimed or so-called rock hound, and he enjoys collecting and polishing rocks. And there's more to the rocks than just this sort of hobby that he has. I think the rocks themselves are sort of a reflection of Andy's character and the way that he approaches life in general. So it's a suitable metaphor for Andy and how he sort of goes about his pursuit of life, his philosophy of life. And when we think about a rock, right, we see rocks as sort of, they are not special until you sort of polish them, spend time carving them, and transforming them into something beautiful and precious. But often we sort of discard them as, you know, there's nothing but dirt. And this is what Andy does with the rocks that he finds in Shawshank area, in the grounds outside the prison. He'll pick up rocks that he'll find in the ground and then spend multiple nights, night after night, sort of polishing the rocks and then carving them and then giving them as gifts to Red, and turning them into something precious and beautiful. So I do think this is a sort of metaphor that we can sort of see as part of Andy's personality. He sees the good in something that is usually just discarded or ignored. He is able to see the good in a character like Red, who is a prisoner and who has spent his life in prison. And Andy also sort of sees the good in the other prisoners and helps them to sort of transform their lives in positive ways. Unlike the prison system itself, Warden Norton and the others sort of discard the men as if they were useless. So we do have a sort of parallel between the rocks and transformation of rocks and then Andy's approach to helping the prisoners sort of rehabilitate themselves and transform their lives through education. In particular, he is the one who introduces the library system within Shawshank. So some strategies just to get you going in your reading of the text. Make note of any sort of important symbols that you find, underline them, highlight them, make note of them, and note any sort of themes. Hope, freedom, and redemption are all sort of important ideas in this text, and you'll see the importance of these as you read through the story. You can also note the inner and outer conflicts that each prisoner faces. So the outer conflicts, obviously these are physical circumstances, violence being the main one, but the inner conflicts are also important. So how do the prisoners sort of deal with the psychological obstacles of survival while stuck in prison? And what do they have to overcome in terms of mental obstacles in order to endure? So look for examples of institutionalization in the characters. And then you can also identify any transformations that you notice in the characters. In particular, Red's character, I think, is the one that undergoes the most transformations over the course of the narrative. And while he's telling us a story about Andy Dufresne, he's also telling a story about himself and how he has become changed through his interactions with Andy. And then you can consider what you think the underlying message of the story to be. So while it's a story about prisoners sort of incarcerated in this corrupt institution, it's also a story about larger themes or ideas, more universal themes or ideas about human existence. and what it means to be a human, what it means to be sort of an individual, and to challenge the powers that be, so to face obstacles and overcome adversity. So I thought we would start our discussion of the text by looking at more closely at the two main characters, Andy and Red. So we'll start with Red, and then I'll just again make note of some of the important character traits and qualities, characteristics that describe each character. And then we can think about how each man fits within that prison system that we talked about in the last lecture, and think about the reputation and what this reputation of each man, how it plays out over the course of the narrative. So Red, we know from the very first sentence, he sort of states, "There's a guy like me in every state and federal prison in America. I'm the guy who can get it for you. Tailor-made cigarettes, a bag of reefer if you're partial to that, a bottle of brandy to celebrate your son or daughter's high school graduation, or almost anything else. Within reason, that is." So he is the guy who can get things for you, for people in prison. He has a reputation as the guy who can get things, and in this way he has a certain amount of power and prestige or status amongst the prisoners because of his connections. We also learn about the crime that he's committed. So he says, "I came to Shawshank when I was just 20, and I'm one of the few people in our happy little family willing to own up to what they did. I committed murder. I put a large insurance policy on my wife, who was 3 years older than I was, and then I fixed the brakes of the Chevrolet coupe her father had given us as a wedding present." And then it turns out he ends up killing not only his wife, but the neighbor woman and the neighbor woman's son. And then he's given 3 life sentences for this crime, and he ends up spending his whole adult life behind bars. Andy, on the other hand, does not seem to have the same, at least initially, he doesn't fit in with the other prisoners, and he seems very much vulnerable at the start before he is able to sort of accommodate or adapt to the prison environment. So it describes Andy on the bottom of page 17. It says, "When Andy came to Shawshank in 1948, he was 30 years old. He was a short, neat little man with sandy hair and small, clever hands. He wore gold-rimmed spectacles. His fingernails were always clipped, and they were always clean. That's a funny thing to remember about a man, I suppose, but it seems to sum Andy up for me. He always looked as if he should have been wearing a tie. On the outside, he had been a vice president in the trust department of a large Portland bank. Good work for a man as young as he was." Andy's character, again, is reflected in his appearance somewhat. So he's a very neat, well put together, very cool, calm, and composed character, and very sort of conservative looking. Doesn't really sort of fit in with the rest of the men, who are a little bit more tough and hard on the exterior. Andy, on the other hand, he is sort of very dispassionate, very cold, it seems, and this at first sort of sets him apart and makes him sort of stand out amongst the other men. And it's a characteristic that actually hurts Andy during his trial. He was asked to stand in his own defense, and he has a very cool, calm, dispassionate personality, and this is what the sort of jury takes as coldness and being unfeeling, and they see this as being something that reveals his guilt, even though we find out that he is in fact innocent of his crime of murder for his wife and her lover's affair and then killing them.